Chair, RB, in my first speech to you as Chair of Council, I want to begin by saying how truly honoured I am to represent our incredible medical workforce that looks after the health of the UK, despite the toughest of challenges. As I look around this hall, what's so special about this event, our annual representative meeting, is that it brings together the entire profession, from medical students, doctors in training, established doctors from general practice and hospitals, academics who teach and research, doctors who care for those who defend our country, and those who promote the public's health. The BMA is truly the voice of the UK's doctors, and will use the next 4 days to make all we stand for heard loudly, far and beyond. In my first year as chair, I've had the privilege of seeing the world through the lens of the wider profession. I've travelled the UK to hear the issues affecting doctors in all branches of practice and in each of the 4 nations. I visited regional councils and divisions to meet grassroots doctors. What's absolutely clear to me is that the BMA is not a building in London, Cardiff, Belfast or Edinburgh. The BMA is its members, the dedicated doctors and medical students we represent. I came to this job having chaired a branch of practice, rooted in our fundamental role as a trade union fighting for improved terms and conditions for doctors. Over the past year, I've also seen firsthand the sheer breadth of the BMA's professional work, promoting the science and art of medicine, and which also defines us as doctors. In the past year, I'm proud that the BMA has championed legislation for presumed consent for organ donation, potentially saving the lives of hundreds of patients who die every year waiting for a donor. Proud that we've opposed the cruel health consequences of putting children into solitary confinement in the youth justice system, and have fought for parity for patients with mental health issues. Most recently, we won protection for migrants whose data was being unethically shipped by NHS Digital to immigration authorities. Our values go beyond our own shores. We've spoken up for doctors working in regimes where they're compelled to participate in torture and punished if they do not, or thrown into jail for simply speaking up for their patients' health. This renders futile the oft-debated question of whether the BMA is a trade union or a professional organisation. We are, of course, both. We should all be proud that the BMA speaks out about what's right, about what's wrong, because that represents the soul of being a doctor. The scores of motions in this and past ARMs demonstrates with democratic clarity that the professional work of the BMA matters immensely to members. I also want to scotch the flawed binary argument about whether we're here to represent doctors or to save the NHS. Let's be clear. Fighting for the NHS is the same as fighting for doctors. It's fighting for protection. It's fighting for protection of fair national terms of service, not being at the mercy of insecure local profit-driven contracts. Fighting for a system in which patients trust us as doctors, treating them in their best interests with no suspicion of personal gain. Fighting for the principle of treating patients according to need, regardless of who they are. Fighting for a national infrastructure of research, education, and training doctors for their future. How can we not fight for the NHS when the NHS defines our working experience, our values, and sense of purpose? But RB, we know the NHS has been systematically and scandalously starved for years. It lacks doctors, it lacks nurses, it lacks beds. It's not just the channel that separates us from our European neighbours, but a vast funding gap equating to 35,000 hospital beds or 10,000 doctors. We're being run ragged, a health service of gaps and stopgaps, where 2 out of 3 juniors report holes in their rota, 3/4 of medical specialties have unfilled training posts, and 1/3 of GP practices have long-term vacancies. It's the new norm. RB, it's a new low. How could the Prime Minister have possibly said we were better prepared for winter than ever before? Does being prepared mean resorting to precipitously cancelling tens of thousands of operations before Christmas due to a lack of capacity, adding further delay, anxiety and suffering to patients who've already waited months for an operation? Is being prepared having 17,000 acutely sick patients queuing in ambulances outside emergency departments in the first week of January, since there wasn't the space to admit them? Are we at a time we should be celebrating the NHS's 70th anniversary? We're breaking all the wrong records, having seen the worst ever performance on A&E waiting times on record. Do you remember when winter pressures only happened in the winter? We now have an all-year crisis. Today in Brighton, we may be in the midst of summer, but in the NHS, it's still winter. Projected emergency admissions, trolley waits, and patients waiting more than 4 hours show that this summer will be at best similar to the winter of 2015. Underfunding is also undermining NHS values. It's shameful that within the statutory duty to make ends meet, some hospitals resort to charging sick patients and relatives more in car parking fees than they'd pay in the high street outside. Shameful that NHS England is pressurising GPs to tell patients to buy medications over the counter instead of issuing an NHS prescription. Expecting elderly patients, those on low income or chronic debility, to start paying for a range of treatments, including fungal infections, scabies, eczema. And if they can't afford it, should they just suffer and do without? This is an affront to the core NHS principle of patients receiving treatment on the basis of need, not the ability to pay. But worse, it's coming from the very people who run the NHS. Hospital doctors are pressurized to discharge ill patients to free up beds, while also knowing that the community doesn't have the facilities to care for them. GPs are pressurized not to refer patients and even given financial incentives to keep patients away from hospital to save costs. There are reports of hospitals colluding with statistical fiddles to help meet A&E targets. All this is inevitably affecting patient safety, with bed occupancy in some trusts running up to 100%, well above the recommended safe limits of 85%. Is it safe for patients who should be admitted in an emergency to suffer ambulance delays of several hours, with some not surviving the wait, as reported last winter? Is it safe to work in an understaffed environment of perpetual rota gaps? Is it safe to manage patients in car parks because the hospital has no space? Or to treat patients on trolleys in corridors rather than the facilities of a ward? Is it safe for GPs to spend just 10 minutes with patients with 4 or more complex problems? There were 10,000 more deaths in England and Wales in the first 7 weeks of this year than in the previous year. And this should raise serious questions. In the BMA's just published major member survey, 4 in 5 doctors said that lack of resources is significantly affecting quality and safety in the NHS. The clear message to the Health and Social Care Secretary, who positions himself as the champion of patient safety, is that the single greatest factor affecting safe care is chronic underfunding, which has starved and paralysed the NHS of its ability to care. And it's our duty of candour to inform the public and patients accordingly. The current plight of the NHS is leading some to question its fitness as a model, arguing that we should adopt other systems from other nations. This is flawed thinking. Repeated independent studies show that the NHS is leading the world in providing cost-effective, universal care and is not plagued with the wasted costs of shuffling claims and chasing bills you find in many other systems. It's not the model of the NHS which lets it down. It's the brutal, chronic lack of resources, period. For those who say we should copy France and Germany, I say first, remove tens of thousands of their doctors, nurses, hospital beds and social care facilities and cut their funding to the level we suffer in the UK, and then see how they fare. So the Prime Minister's belated and desperately needed announcement of increased NHS funding after years of denial is a positive step. But the investment is still well short of what's needed, and we need it now. We will continue to campaign to be at parity with our European neighbours. Meanwhile, it's crucial that this money is delivered to treat patients and attract and retain staff, not serve political ideology. And the BMA will be putting to government tangible proposals to support frontline doctors. Given the taxpayer is being asked to contribute more, the government has an equal moral imperative to stop wasting billions from current taxpayers' pockets on the damaging NHS market in England. Money which should be used to treat patients, but is instead being squandered on futile transactions, bureaucratic processes, fragmentation, and PFI deals. It's morally reprehensible that millions of pounds of public money is swallowed up by competitive tendering alone, where Virgin can sue the health service for hundreds of thousands of pounds if it misses out on a contract, and an NHS trust has to spend £500,000 bidding to get work back from private hands and is then blocked from doing so. That's why the BMA supported the judicial review on accountable care organisations, which operating in this market madness risks large geographical areas being taken over by the private sector with 10-year contracts which they could terminate early. Has government forgotten private provider Circle abandoning Hitchingbrook Hospital just 3 years after taking it over simply because it wasn't profitable enough, and leaving the NHS to pick up the pieces of disruption to services, staff and patients? The same overspent NHS that bails out the costs of patients treated in private units who then develop complications at 2 a.m. needing emergency care in their local acute trust. RB, what more evidence does the government need about the costs and damage of private outsourcing after the collapse of Carillion and the utter shameful incompetence of Capita? Let me now turn to culture in the NHS and safety. It's 5 years since Don Berwick, the renowned international patient safety expert, produced his recommendations to government in the wake of the Francis inquiry. He said, quote, "NHS staff are not to blame. In the vast majority of cases, it's systems, environment, and constraints they face that lead to patient safety problems." 5 years on, what lessons have we learnt? After a young child unexpectedly, tragically, died in hospital, and an internal inquiry by the Trust reported 23 recommendations and 79 action points, is it right that culpability was fixated on a trainee doctor having returned from maternity leave, instead of also holding to account the under-resourced, understaffed, and unsupported environment she was forced to work in? Is it any surprise that half the doctors in our survey practice defensively because they feel they inhabit a blame culture, being targeted and scapegoated when they're struggling to do their duty against all odds? And is it any surprise doctors are choosing to leave the NHS or retire early in these intolerable conditions? Berwick also said that fear is toxic for safety in the NHS, and yet 95% of doctors told us they were fearful of making a medical error and more than half fear they'll be blamed for errors due to pressures or system failings in their workplace. Only a quarter are happy to record reflections, the rest fearing they could be used against them. This defensive culture is bad for doctors, bad for patients, and bad for safety. I'm therefore pleased that the BMA will be providing evidence in the appeal of Dr. Bawa Garba to raise these very issues in the interests of doctors and patients themselves. Meanwhile, the BMA is actively supporting doctors working in a system under pressure with a comprehensive web resource of guidance for doctors on how to raise concerns and report system pressures. Probably the most harrowing cloud hanging over any doctor is the fear of being criminalized for making an error. The BMA robustly responded to the Williams Review on gross negligence manslaughter. We're pleased it heeded our call to define a higher bar for a criminal prosecution, to end the GMC's ability to appeal MPTS rulings, and that reflective notes will not be able to be used in GMC investigations. But we insist these reflections need full legal protection for doctors to feel safe to learn. We'll similarly contribute to the Claire Marks Review, calling for whole system reform from the role and consistency of coroners to that of medical expert evidence. Nor has the government learnt about the destructive impact of financial targets in an underfunded NHS, which both Francis and Berwick highlighted as undermining safety in mid-staffs. 5 years on, 3/4 of doctors say that financial targets still override patient care, while the board agendas of NHS organisations across the UK remain obsessed with balancing unbalanceable books, when what they should be obsessed about is quality and safety. The NHS has no shortage of regulation, with regulators bearing down heavily on those who provide care. But what about those who set the rules? Those who knowingly demand the impossible? Those all too present when it comes to micromanaging performance, but all too absent when it comes to providing the resources? We urgently need a change in focus so that the system itself is regulated, starting with government, its funding, its policies, and the culture it sets from the top. And in autumn, the BMA will hold a safety summit to specifically address this. We need to address a culture of safety, because not only is it costing lives, it's hemorrhaging money. Today, the NHS in England alone has a staggering £65 billion in liabilities for medical negligence claims, and which, in a safer NHS, would liberate resources to be used to treat patients instead. We should rightly, vigorously oppose government policies that are failing patients and staff. But equally, it's us as doctors who understand the health service at the coalface, and why I've launched the BMA's vision for an NHS that is caring, supportive, and collaborative, rather than leaving it to armchair policymakers and politicians who've never treated a patient telling us what's best. Our vision will be informed by the recent all-member survey, the most comprehensive of its kind, and over the coming year, we'll hold a series of regional and national member events, inviting government and other policymakers to work with us on our agenda that we as doctors have set. We'll define a culture in which doctors can hold their hands up when things go wrong, and instead of becoming scapegoats, they help the health service learn to become safer. A culture in which you need more knowledge or training, you'll be given the time and support to acquire it. A culture in which you're recognized for working over and beyond. A culture of fairness in which you're rewarded according to your merit and merit alone. A culture in which we embrace diversity and inclusivity. Next month, we mark the 70th birthday of our National Health Service, and 70 years since the Empire Windrush docked in Britain. The two are inseparable because without its overseas medical workforce, the NHS would not have survived a single day. But we cannot truly celebrate until BME doctors have genuine equal opportunity in the NHS. We'll be holding a summit next month on not just talking about, but tackling racial bias in the health service. A culture that positively welcomes and values skilled overseas doctors who come here to acquire specialist training and in doing so provide the NHS with a vital service when we're desperately short of doctors. I'm proud that the BMA campaigned tirelessly alongside others, that I wrote open letters with other bodies to both Home Secretaries this year, and which finally achieved the removal of the Tier 2 visa cap for doctors. Proof, RB, that we can overcome hostile political ideology and intransigence with collective pressure. We also need a culture in which we can work together as doctors, as one team, and why those damaging walls which divide doctors working in hospitals and general practice must fall. Patients rightly view us as part of one system, looking after them as they move from a hospital bed to their homes, or from a GP consultation to an outpatient clinic. 93% of the profession think primary and secondary care doctors should work together more closely, and yet only 16% believe there are clear channels of communication between the two. There's something deeply wrong, RB, when doctors in primary and secondary care probably spend more time together in 4 days at ARM than they do for the rest of the year in their workplace. This must mean repealing competition law and the purchaser-provider split in England that is totally incompatible with even the government's claim to want integrated care. The past year has taught me that we are one interdependent profession, facing similar brutal pressures wherever we work. That if one part of the medical system fails, it pulls others down with it. And why we must never collude with robbing Peter to pay Paul between different sectors of the profession. RB, adversity brings us together, but I want more than to simply share a lifeboat. We began life as one at medical school with years of grueling study and exams. We together stepped into hospital wards as newly qualified doctors and then branched out into our chosen specialties. Let us now rekindle our common origin and work together in our collective drive for an NHS that has the resources and culture to be truly caring, supportive, and collaborative. RB, I want the BMA to enter a new chapter in its long history. As we expect of others, the BMA must be a learning organisation driven by reflection and continuous improvement. A BMA that reaches out more and understands the needs of our whole membership. At the end of this ARM, we'll have a council double its current size, with more than half of those elected being new members. I'm looking forward to working with this broader and more representative pool of talent than we've ever had before. Finally, for their incredible support, I want to thank the chief officers, council members, the branch of practice committees and their chairs, those who lead the professional committees, the national chairs in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, and the countless staff, all of whom have supported me as a new chair with new ideas. RB, we're here for 4 days. 4 days to speak up for what's right. 4 days to champion our great profession. 4 days to identify everything that holds us back from being the doctors we want to be, and 4 days to come up with solutions. 4 days to propel the BMA into a year of renewal. RB, let's not waste a minute. Let's get started. Thank you.